Shalom Aleichem. The Sikha of Kisavai Aleph is a Sikha that is from Shabbos Parshas Kisavai, Tafshin Chav Ches. And at the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said the Sikha with a few more insights than what came into the final edition. And in general, I find that quite often, when you look in the Teres Menachem, the way they summarize the Sikha is brilliant, and it highlights certain things that, at least when I was learning the Sikha, I struggled to fully grasp. I found it to be a bit of a fragmented style, hard to follow. So this helped me summarize it. It says like this. The Sikha is a beer in Rashi's Pshat on the Pasuk, Hayom Hazeh, Hashem Elokecha Mitzavcha. Now the Rebbe introduced the Sikha by saying that the Mefarshim of Rashi, Taka Shtel, they sit on the second part of Rashi, not so much the first part. But still, I haven't found the Pshat, says the Rebbe, that explains Rashi b'shleimus completely in a way that will be understood even in a simple mind, b'derech Pshat. That's the intention of Rashi. Now, Laha'ir, to point out that even though this Pirush Rashi, Pascal Mevarachta, is in Medrash Tanchuma, it's not a proof from the fact that it's a Medrash Tanchuma that it's a Pshat al derech hadrush, and then it's not Pshat, it's only drush. Because even in Medrash, you sometimes find things al derech Pshat. Just like in Gemara, you find, which is halacha, you find things in Yanei drush. And Rebbe explained so interesting. In the beginning of Tanya, it says, Amar Azal Medrash, La Kadosh Baruch Hu Batzadikim Shem Muatim. It's in the Perik Aleph, Amad V'Shaslan, the second page. Why does it say Amad Azal Medrash? It's a shtickle Gemara. It's a Gemara in Yuma Lamed Ches. So the Rebbe says because it's Nechelik Hadrush Shebe Gemara, which is halacha. So this is the drush of Gemara. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe refers to it by Medrash. The Rebbe continues and says in Medrash sometimes you have halacha. So just because it comes from the Medrash doesn't mean it's not pshat. It could be pshat, because Rashi only brings pshat. So back to the Sikha, this is a pshat on the pasuk Hayom Hazeh, which goes on Rosh Hashanah, based on Likutei Torah, Hashem Elokecha Mitzavcha. So on that, the Rashi says, B'chol yom yenecha chadashim, kilu b'yom mitzavis aleim, just like you were commanded, as if you were commanded that day. And then in the second Rashi, V'shamarta v'asisoisam, you should keep them and do them. Baskel mevarachta, the Baskel blesses and says, Hevesa bikudim hayom, you brought bikudim today, tishna l'shana haba, you will repeat it in the coming year. So on the first part of Rashi, the first Rashi, the Rebbe explains that because it says Hayom Hazeh, not Hayom Stam, like by Parshas Veschanan and Ekev, Hayom Hazeh, Hashem Elokecha Mitzavcha. So Rashi explains that the Chiddush is not only when you keep the Torah mitzvahs has to be Chadashim, but B'chol Yom. Even when you're not busy and occupied with the Chukim Ha'ela Bikurim, it should always be by you. Now, when the Rebbe said the Sikhi, he added another point. He says another Chiddush is, when they were commanded on Bikurim, they weren't able to keep the mitzvah, because you were only Mechayev and Bikurim once they came into Eretz Yisrael and split it. So when the time would come to be Mekayim the mitzvah, 14 years later, 7 years of conquering and 7 years of splitting, dividing, so will be a Davar Chadash. And nevertheless, says the Rebbe, it's not enough, but it has to be Chadashim Kilu Baybayim Nitztaveis Alem, that you were commanded it. Not only Chadash, because it's the first time you're able to implement it, but it's the first time you're hearing it. Because even when you do something for the first time, it's a chiluk if you already heard about it a while ago, a tzivu yashan, an old tzivu, or a new tzivu. Fine, so that's on the first part of Rashi. On the second part of Rashi, which is the majority of the Sikha, Baskel Mevarachta, Hevesa bikudim hayom tishna l'shana haba, the Rebbe says, because this pasuk came after the finishing of the mitzvah bikudim and vidu maistas, which is confession that you say when you give a maisa, and after that, right after this pasuk, we talk about shvacham shel Yisrael, the praise of the Yidden. So therefore, v'shamarta v'asiso is something that's not. There's no room to explain tzivui. We already had the tzivuyim, but rather a bracha, tishna. it's not a commandment, but rather Hashem's promising you will be able to repeat this in the coming year. Schar, which is midah keneged midah. But at the end of the Sikha, the Rebbe points out because this bracha is a baskel, therefore a chet can cancel it. So there is still bechira chavshis. And the reason that Rashi explains that's going on bikurim, which is two things back, not on Maisis that we spoke before, because you can't say Tishna on Maisis because he just brought Maisis at the last minute. So what are you going to say? Next year you should also bring it at the last minute. That's not, there's no bracha there. So therefore you must say the bracha is by bikurim. And this is shaykh to the words that before the pasuk Hayom Hazeh, just before the words Hayom Hazeh, Eretz Zavas Chalav Udvash, which is dafka shaykh to bikurim, not to Meiser, because you don't bring Meiser on that thing. So that's the Sikha the Rebbe said. Now, interesting, when you look the Sikhas, the way he put it together, it combined from later on the Farbrengen, which wasn't even connected so much to this Rashi. After that, the Rebbe went and explained the Pirkei Avos that we learn on Parshas Kisavai that year and this year, which is Gimel and Daled. And the Rebbe, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it's quite the Geshmak and Lashonis the Rebbe uses. He says in these Prakim, there are a few statements from a Baal Shemske Yid. Who's the Baal Shemske Yid that the Pirkei Avos quotes? Rab Chanina ben Doisa, who was a Malumid ben Nisim, was experienced, just Nisim were always happening to him. It wasn't a Davar Chadash. He was used to it. And what does he say? Kol sheyiras chetoi keidemes lechachmasei chachmasei miskayemes. The kol shechachmasei keidemes leyiras chetoi ein chachmasei miskayemes. So yiras chet has to come before chachma. The Rebbe explains. Obviously, we're not talking about silly chachma or non-teira chachma. We're talking about chacham be'emes, a chachma lekis, and still you need to have yiras chetoi. And the Rebbe says that's also the heart of what we always say in Chassidus, that everything in Askala, every intellectual idea has to have a bechein, has to have a peil mamash. And the Rebbe says the bechein, the peil mamash, is not only an independent thing, but the Askala atzma, the actual idea, must be a peil mamashtik idea. Otherwise, ein chachmas miskayemes. Then the Rebbe goes into a whole thing to explain what the idea of keidemes is. It comes first in time. Does it? What exactly does it play out? And it's quite an extensive nekuda. And the Rebbe talks about Yira Tatar, Yira Ilah. The Rebbe talks about Chet Milash, sin, Milash and Chisarin, and Shleimah Melech and Basheva. It's a fascinating thing. You could see it in starting page 449 in Teres Menachem Chelik Nun Gimel. And then the Rebbe finish off and says that the Chanina Medois is telling us Yiras Chetoi comes before Chachma, similar to the fact that Bikurim must come before Tumah. So this is where the connection happens with the previous Sikha. That Tumah is Torah. Interesting, the Rebbe points out, because Tumah is Oisius Torah Mem, which goes on Torah, which was given in 40 days. The Rebbe quotes that brings that out from the Zohar. Bikurim comes and refers to the Etzem HaNeshama, which comes even before Torah. And Shaykh to the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah, the Kabbalas El B'tzad Etzem HaNeshama. However, you have to bring this power, Bikurim, into the keiches, into your pnimius. Has to break down into the sheichem, shivteichem, chaytevetzecha, shememecha. It can't just say, Atem nitzavim hayom, you're standing today. You have to bring it down into real life, into everything. And that is why it says tefillah that's why they instituted tefillah instead of bikurim, because through tefillah, you get a connection with etzem haneshama. So that's how interesting that now we combined it in the Sikha, it's combined in the Sikha, but originally it was said as two different points. And that finishes off. That's why it says, Kol sheyiras chetei kedemes lechachmasei, chachmasei miskayemes, because even though you're supposed to learn Torah right away, even shalei lishma, if you don't have another choice, but the Rebbe says, when you're learning lishma, then you should make sure that your yiras chet comes before the chachma, meaning that you should bring into the limud Torah, the shorish of the etzem and the shama. That's the Yiras Chet. And why did Abchanin ben Doisa say this? Because he was, as we said, experienced in Nisim. So his whole hanhaga, his whole behavior was in the way l'mayla min hateva, and therefore he could demand limud HaTorah in the way of shorish and the shama to yet chachmasei miskayemes. And that finished off with the bracha that we should have a ksiv chesima teva and bias Mashiach tzedkenu even before the Rosh Hashanah should be taken from Miyad Mamash.